Crimea, long regarded as an impenetrable stronghold for Russian President Vladimir Putin, has devolved into a critical strategic vulnerability for Moscow, with the peninsula's 2.5 million residents grappling with an unprecedented humanitarian and infrastructural collapse. Daily life across the region has deteriorated drastically over a short period, once basic necessities now qualify as scarce luxuries amid cascading shortages of fuel, power, water, transportation, and essential groceries. A catastrophic fuel crisis has gripped the entire peninsula, leaving local gas stations consistently empty with no reliable daily fuel supply for residents and vehicles. This energy scarcity is just one layer of the worsening turmoil. Electrical grids operate on a chaotic, unregulated schedule with no equitable power distribution across Crimea. Critical public services, communication networks, supply chains, and retail food systems have all steadily broken down, eroding living standards and draining public patience. Long suppressed public frustration has finally erupted into open discontent, a reality even Moscow's installed regional governor can no longer deny or downplay. As living conditions grow increasingly uninhabitable, a mass exodus has swept across Crimea. Lengthy vehicle queues have formed nonstop at the Kerch Bridge, the last viable escape route off the peninsula for civilians and military personnel alike. This flight extends far beyond ordinary residents. Tens of thousands of Russian Black Sea Fleet troops and their family members, stationed long-term in Crimea, have joined the evacuation wave, marking a quiet but large-scale military withdrawal. This military evacuation is not speculative or rumor-based. Classified intercepted military documents confirm coordinated withdrawal preparations uncovered by pro-Ukrainian partisan group Void. The urgent official directive bears the direct signature of Russian Black Sea Fleet Commander Admiral Sergei Pinchuk, mandating comprehensive evacuation readiness across all local military installations. Per the intercepted order, every military unit and facility within the Sevastopol garrison was required to compile detailed rosters of service members and civilian staff's family members by a strict July 10 deadline. This mandate covers all fleet personnel, including naval crews, coastal defense troops, administrative officials, commanding officers, and contracted civilian employees. Given the Black Sea Fleet's massive scale, boasting approximately 25,000 active personnel, including naval infantry since Crimea's annexation, the compiled family lists signal an impending large-scale logistical evacuation operation affecting tens of thousands of people. This formal July evacuation order concluded a months-long sequence of escalating withdrawal preparations, with early warning signs emerging as far back as April. ADS, a partisan network embedded within Russia's Crimean military apparatus, first reported widespread panic among fleet units in spring, documenting that high-ranking officers had already begun relocating their families out of the region voluntarily. A second, more definitive phase unfolded in mid-June when ATS intelligence confirmed concrete plans to relocate the Black Sea Fleet's core command infrastructure from Sevastopol to Novorossiysk. Many senior officers even preemptively sold their Crimean properties in anticipation of the official evacuation order, foregoing waiting for formal military instructions. The July written directive ultimately formalized these months of incremental retreat efforts, forming a clear timeline of withdrawal, initial unconfirmed reports, verified intelligence alerts, and final official military orders, all pointing to a full-scale exodus from Crimea. Notably, military elites are prioritizing their own escape ahead of ordinary civilians, as confirmed by both the ATUS Resistance Network and Ukraine's RBC news outlet. High-ranking Black Sea Fleet officers who enjoy privileged access to fuel supplies and classified military intelligence began moving their families to Novorossiysk long before the public crisis escalated and prior to official evacuation mandates. This elite flight exposes a stark disconnect between Moscow's public posturing and its private strategic assessments. The Kremlin's grip on Crimea is rapidly unraveling. The situation carries striking historical parallels. A century earlier in 1920, during Russia's Civil War, the very same Black Sea Fleet staged a mass evacuation from Crimea, deploying 126 vessels to transport 150,000 people to modern-day Istanbul. Today, most of the fleet's warships have already abandoned Sevastopol, leaving only local civilians stranded to endure the crisis and wait in endless bridge queues to flee. Satellite imagery vividly illustrates the scale of the exodus, revealing a 10-kilometer traffic jam of roughly 1,500 vehicles queuing for hours to cross the Kerch Bridge. Traffic data confirms a lopsided migration pattern. Nearly no vehicles enter Crimea, while outbound traffic doubles inbound volumes. Critically, Ukrainian forces have intentionally held back from fully disabling the Kerch Bridge, adopting a deliberate strategic approach. As stated by Ukraine's Unmanned Systems Forces Command, Ukrainian strikes target Crimea's entry routes rather than exit corridors, repurposing the Kerch Bridge as a controlled escape valve for occupying Russian forces and residents rather than sealing off the peninsula entirely. The bridge has become the sole viable escape route after alternative transit links were severed. Attacks on the North Crimean Canal's railway bridge canceled dozens of daily train services, while land routes through occupied southern Ukraine are now plagued by constant drone threats, rendering them impassable for most travelers. The demographic reversal unfolding in Crimea is equally significant. Following its 2014 annexation of the peninsula, Moscow resettled 500,000 to 800,000 Russian citizens in Crimea via lucrative incentives such as low-cost mortgages, aiming to dilute the native Ukrainian population and solidify Russian control. Now, a large portion of these relocated residents are fleeing back to their original hometowns, some traveling over 3,000 kilometers to distant regions like Barnaul and Siberia. Resentment toward Crimean residents has even spread to mainland Russian communities amid the fuel shortage crisis. Local gas station operators in Krasnodar Krai have refused to service vehicles with Crimean license plates, cutting off external fuel access for peninsula residents. For those who remain in Crimea, strict fuel rationing systems using coupons and QR codes have been implemented, yet supplies remain chronically depleted. Gasoline prices have skyrocketed to $22 per gallon in Yalta, while diesel is capped at 20 liters per vehicle with a starting price of 190 rubles per liter. Pervasive fuel shortages have triggered mass business closures and widespread job losses, leaving low-income residents living paycheck to paycheck with no stable livelihoods or survival prospects. Economic uncertainty has become as crippling as the resource shortages themselves. Compounding the crisis, Crimea's power infrastructure has sustained relentless attacks. Up to 12 substations are targeted daily, with 83 energy facilities disabled in July alone. Regional authorities have been forced to shut down street lighting and distribute portable generators to mitigate blackouts, while communities like Krasnoperekopsk face days of simultaneous water and power outages. Locals in Kerch fear permanent grid failure. Without consistent electricity, household refrigeration systems fail, leading to mass food spoilage. Retail stores have implemented strict food rationing, limiting each resident to fixed quantities of milk, sugar, and sunflower oil. Even basic communication systems have collapsed, prompting regional administrators to install outdated coin-operated landline phones in public squares across Yevpatoria and Jankoy, a drastic technological regression for the region. By late July, living conditions had deteriorated to catastrophic levels. A July 21 field report from The Guardian confirmed over 70% of Crimea's 2.5 million inhabitants face sustained power and water cuts, with residents describing a return to primitive, pre-modern living conditions amid summer heat waves. We were told for 12 years that Crimea was completely safe. In just 1 month, we've lost electricity, water, and fuel. We've been thrown back to the Stone Age, said Marina, a Yevpatoria guest house owner. A local restaurant operator named Alexei echoed the despair, stating that residents are forced to scramble for fuel as if surviving a dystopian survival game. Satellite data analyzed by Medusa on July 23 further quantified the scale of the collapse. NASA nighttime light imagery revealed Crimea's overall illumination had plummeted to just 20% of its normal baseline level. Following strikes on the Balaklava thermal power plant, experts warned the peninsula is on the brink of a full-scale humanitarian catastrophe. Power failures disable water pumps, collapse sewage treatment systems, spoil food stockpiles, and render mobile networks entirely dependent on finite generator power, with no immediate relief in sight. The strikes continued, intensifying through late July. On July 26, Ukrainian drone attacks targeted the 470 MW Tavria thermal power plant near Suvorovsky, sparking major fires and triggering widespread blackouts across Crimea's northwest, east, and southern regions. The same night, Ukrainian forces also struck a Chernomaz fuel facility and a Russian drone relay station. Even Crimea's Moscow-installed authorities were forced to acknowledge the external attacks as the cause of the systemic power failure. The worsening crisis has silenced no one, including pro-Kremlin propagandists and loyalist bloggers. On July 26th, pro-war social media influencer Alexander Gurney posted a scathing assessment on Facebook, describing Crimea's situation as utterly horrific. He detailed collapsed public services, gasoline prices reaching 250 rubles per liter, a total halt to tourism and economic activity, widespread water and power shortages, and 50 to 100% inflated consumer prices. He criticized locals for spending their last savings on generators that cannot be fueled, openly questioning whether Russia's military campaign constitutes a victory. Gurney also highlighted growing public desperation. Local residents were launching online fundraisers to purchase air defense equipment for the region, while the Russian federal government remained silent and passive, leaving residents reliant on Ukrainian telegram channels for accurate news. Russia's military infrastructure in Crimea continued to face targeted strikes in late July. Ukraine's main intelligence directorate confirmed the destruction of an S-400 Triumph air defense system launcher and 96L6 radar station in occupied Crimea overnight on July 25 to 26, releasing official strike footage of the high-value military assets' destruction. A further drone attack on July 28 disabled a Feodosia electrical substation, triggering total blackouts in Kerch and Feodosia, with severe voltage drops and flickering power in Simferopol and Sevastopol. On July 27, Sevastopol's Moscow-appointed Governor Mikhail Razvozhayev announced emergency power restrictions to prevent a total grid collapse, activating special operational protocols for energy facilities and switching all critical social infrastructure to backup generator power. The sustained siege conditions have finally unleashed long-suppressed public anger against regional authorities and federal leadership. Thousands of furious critical comments accumulated under a public post by regional head Sergei Aksionov, with many users directly challenging President Putin's unfulfilled promises. One local resident questioned whether the head of state had lied after Putin publicly guaranteed imminent land and sea fuel supplies for Crimea, mere days before supplies completely dried up. Notably, public discontent is primarily directed at systemic failures and local officials rather than Russia's broader war effort, reflecting deep-seated frustration with mismanagement and broken government pledges. The Crimea crisis stems from a deliberate targeted Ukrainian military strategy codenamed Operation Milichka, launched on July 6, hampered by international sanctions that block large-scale open oil shipments to Crimea. Russia had relied on small, flat-bottomed tankers and barges transporting fuel via the Volga-Don Canal and shallow Azov Sea to larger Black Sea vessels for final delivery to the peninsula. Ukrainian forces specifically targeted this vulnerable feeder fleet, launching strikes on 147 tankers by July 16, 17 of which were critical Azov Sea supply vessels. By July 13th, all maritime oil supply routes to Crimea were fully severed, and local ferry operations were completely paralyzed. Key supply vessels sustained critical damage. The ESK ferry was struck and towed to port. The SKS-1 sank entirely, and multiple other cargo ships, including Maria, Lenta, and Panagia, were either repeatedly damaged or reduced to tow-only barges. The maritime supply chain lost 75% of its operational capacity overall, with a total of 176 vessels and 96 energy facilities disabled by Ukrainian strikes. As summarized by The Economist, Russia now faces an intractable dilemma in Crimea. The peninsula can neither be easily held nor safely abandoned, trapping Moscow in a strategic no-win situation. Crimea holds irreplaceable strategic value for Russia, serving as the primary power projection hub for deploying Caliber missiles across the Mediterranean and Africa, and functioning as the key logistical backbone for Russia's years-long military intervention in Syria. With Russia's influence in Syria collapsing following Bashar al-Assad's decline, Crimea remains Moscow's last critical foothold for southern regional power projection. Losing Crimea would dismantle Russia's entire southern military strategy. Even retreating the Black Sea Fleet to Novorossiysk represents a humiliating strategic admission of defeat. Novorossiysk lacks Sevastopol's critical dry dock facilities and favorable maritime conditions, offering no safe long-term harbor for the fleet, a reality proven by a March drone strike that sank a minesweeper and heavily damaged anti-submarine vessels at the port. Beyond military strategy, Crimea carries immense personal and political significance for Putin. Political analysts argue that losing Crimea would fatally undermine his domestic political legitimacy and dismantle Russia's modern imperial ambitions. Former Russian intelligence deputy Ilya Pavlenko has described Crimea as the golden key to Russia's expansionist foreign policy. For 12 years, Crimea served as Russia's flagship tourist showcase, a core economic pillar for the region. Prior to the crisis, 76% of tourists traveled to Crimea by road. The collapse of fuel supplies instantly paralyzed the tourism industry. Booking volumes plummeted 58% in 2 weeks. One tour operator reported 80% of June reservations were canceled, and student summer camp programs were postponed until September. While roughly 150,000 to 200,000 Russian tourists remained on the peninsula in late June, representing a one-third seasonal drop. The crisis's burden fell disproportionately on small local businesses rather than large resort complexes. A dangerous economic spiral has taken hold. Vanishing tourists force business closures, which deepen economic collapse and further deter future visitors. Crimea's indigenous Tatar community bears the brunt of the crisis, facing disproportionate pressure under Russian occupation. Rifat Chubarov, head of the Mejlis of the Crimean Tatar people, has issued formal survival guidelines for the community, advising residents to stockpile food and medicine, avoid Russian military sites, and prepare emergency shelter plans. The Ukrainian government has also published multilingual emergency survival guides in Ukrainian and Crimean Tatar, offering practical advice including family emergency meeting points, digital data security protocols, and checkpoint safety measures. Despite growing optimism among Crimean residents for liberation, lingering skepticism remains, rooted in the unmet expectations of Ukraine's 2023 counteroffensive. Local residents emphasize a clear plea to Ukrainian forces to see the conflict through to full liberation rather than halting progress midway. Crucially, Crimea has not yet fallen militarily, remaining under formal Russian control with intact reserve forces for the time being. Ukrainian officials offer cautious outlooks. Former Ukrainian Defense Minister Andriy Zahoruk affirms confidence in Crimea's eventual liberation, but acknowledges it will not happen imminently. Ukraine's current strategic advantage is time limited, with an estimated 1 year window before Russia adapts its tactics and fortifies its shadow fleet to defend supply routes. A critical divide also separates siege warfare from full territorial liberation. Ukrainian forces have successfully rendered Crimea uninhabitable through targeted infrastructure strikes, but large-scale ground troop deployments to seize and occupy the peninsula remain stalled by heavy frontline fighting elsewhere. Additionally, authorities warn that prolonged societal pressure can trigger nationalist rallying effects, with crisis-era public anger potentially shifting towards supporting incumbent powers rather than opposing them. The ongoing Crimean crisis stands as a pivotal turning point in the Russia-Ukraine war, challenging observers to weigh its long-term impacts. Will this collapse fundamentally reshape the war's trajectory and end Russia's hold on Crimea, or will Moscow adapt and overcome these devastating hardships to retain control of the peninsula?